So Peterson and the tribes and people like that, naturally the poor people could not afford their carvings, even though they didn't charge that much for them. Most people could not afford to, pay for their carvings. So, and nowadays those are collector's items, just like Andy Anderson, who was a great caricature carver, and they sold their carvings to the more wealthy crowd. In fact, not far from me in Orange, Texas, is the Starks. They were a very wealthy family who owned lumber companies. Probably about 15, 16, 17 miles from where I live, they have what's called the Stark Museum. And it's a Western museum, and the Starks own one of the largest collections of Andy Andersons in the country. And Mr. Stark bought Andy Anderson's carvings, and they are available. You can't see them all at one time, but every once in a while when you go in the museum, they display some of it. I actually saw a display where they showed most all their collection that they had. They have a wonderful collection of Andy Anderson, and we've mentioned that before. His carvings, great caricature carver, and he sold most of his work to wealthier people. That was the Starks at that time. They had a lot of money, owned a lot of land, so they were one of the richest families in Orange, Texas down here. So they had plenty of money. So that's what they bought. There's collection. Now, Axel Peterson Dodelman, or Dodelman, he sold a lot of his carvings when he was young to wealthy families, and they would use them as a lot of them carved a lot of animals and things like that, and they would sell those to the rich people to give to their children as toys. And they actually had pictures of these children playing. I have seen pictures of these children playing with these masterpieces of Axel Dodelman, and the children are playing with pieces that they created for them. And what you have to understand is that these people's pieces were not classic pieces. These were just men who created carvings to, make a living on. So they would sell them to whoever they had to make a living. And a lot of times that went to their children, the people's children. So what would happen is, where a lot of these things came into later on in the 1900s, is once these people would die, they would have these estate sales of the rich, and people would buy these pieces at estate sales, not really knowing all that much about them. In fact, in estate sales, a lot of times they would, it's kind of like this, people watch on TV these people that go and buy these storage sheds that people don't, end up paying for. And I've got a story I can tell you about that. They go buy these storage sheds that people pay for, that don't pay things on, and so it's the same thing. People would go to estate sales, and sometimes they would buy the entire estate sale in a lot, and in there were a lot of these carvings, beautiful carvings, and that they had given to the children, or they would also have these beautiful doll houses that were especially made by woodworkers and stuff like that. So that's where a lot of those things came from that we now have today. And we were finally able to recognize them as who the carver is that did these things. But they were played with by a lot of children. So it goes back, and before I go on, let me tell you the story real quick about the storage shed. We had a guy out there at work, and I'm not trying to get off subject here, but you'll laugh when you hear this story. We had a guy at work that worked in the warehouse out there, and he was a pretty good old boy, but he was kind of I don't know, he was kind of a smart aleck in a lot of ways. Well, anyway, he worked there at the warehouse, and he was stealing. He was stealing stuff out of the warehouse, and he would take the stuff home, or he would take it, and he was stealing so much stuff from the warehouse that he didn't have room for it at his house, so he purchased a storage shed to store this stuff that he had stole. And his name was Patterson, worked out there. And anyway, he wasn't very smart, okay? He had this storage shed, and he quit paying on it. And so when he quit paying on it, he stopped paying on the stupid thing. They eventually, had warned him, look, we're going to sell your stuff and all this kind of things, or, you're going to be left out in the cold. Well, he didn't heed the warnings, and so they decided one day to lock it up, and they put everything up for sale. Well, at that time, we worked for Texaco. And, of course, everybody knows who Texaco is. Texaco's a very well name. And everything that they, of course, had in their warehouses that belonged to them, they had stickers and stuff like that it was Texaco. Well, one of the engineers that worked out there at the plant, he decided to go to one of these estate sales because they were selling one of these. And so he goes there, and he's looking around, and I mean, they got all kind of tools, they got all kind of stuff, and he notices that all this stuff has got Texaco written on it. And he realizes that this is stuff that's been stolen out there from the plant that we worked at. And so he goes and turns this guy in. And of course they investigate, and of course, I mean, he's got stolen equipment all over the place and everything like that. And so he's fired. He loses his job, and is basically, the plant did not press charges against him. Back then, people didn't press charges. They just got their stuff back and didn't want the problem of all the publicity and all that stuff that can come with the media. So he got fired, and they got their stuff back. And I'm talking about, it was pretty nice stuff. And so it's the way things went. And but that was an interesting story that happened back then. It was kind of stupid. He didn't pay his bill on the storage shed, but he didn't do it, so I don't know what he was thinking, but anyway, let's get back to what we were talking about. So that's where a lot of carvers sold, and Anderson sold his complete collection that he was doing. He sold it to the Starks, who were wealthy people, and they now, like I said, distribute it in their museum that they have there. And so that's the way whittling and carving was used back in that period of time. People understood that, and since people made everything, it was a treasure to have those types of things in your possession, having particular pieces. But like I said, most people could not afford those types of things, and so naturally it was more for the wealthy people. So whittling and carving was a necessity back then. Now, the actual term whittling to most people back then was just an old guy that sat on a corner somewhere with a stick, and they used to try to determine, how thin a shavings they could take off of a stick or whatever. And that was actually what was known as whittling. Now, later on they discovered that, hey, you can also create pieces and create things that are important. You can actually create figures and those type of things. But most of the time, when a person pulled out a pocket knife, and that's what they used to whittle back then, they used their pocket knives, and they sharpened them in primitive ways, most of them on hard stones or sharpening stones, and that's how they created those knives to whittle with. And every man, because people got all messed up about anybody carrying a pocket knife now. You can even be arrested in some states for carrying a knife that's so big and everything like that. But everybody, I remember when I was a young man, everybody carried a pocket knife. Everybody. Not women now, but men did. Every man had a pocket knife. Us kids, we had one, and we were going to school because we didn't even think twice about pulling a pocket knife on somebody. That was just, we just didn't do that because we knew the consequences that we were going to suffer if we did. But we carried pocket knives. We used to play mumbly peg at school. We used to do those type of things. We would take the knife out. We would, flip it and hit it on the ground and do things like that. It was common. It was a common thing that we would do. So everybody carried a pocket knife. So for someone just to take out a pocket knife and start whittling or doing something like that, that was not unusual. That was very, very common in those times. Now we've become so afraid of a pocket knife or of anything like that. And maybe I understand that because we have become a much more violent society. But people become scared if someone pulls out a pocket knife now, and makes us think that that someone's trying to do something or do harm to us. It was nothing. So we did this during lunch at school. We'd sit there with our knives, and we'd, like I said, we'd play mumbly peg. We'd try to see if we could, how fancy we could slip it off our shoulders, or not shoulders, but our hands and all that other stuff. So a different era, a different time. So since everyone carried a pocket knife, it was nothing for someone to pull it out, get a piece of wood, and just sort of sit there and just whittle. Just create something, even if it was just a little whistle or whatever, because that's what most people created at that time, was little things, just little gadgets and doodads, and maybe you carve a little bird or something like that, in other words, as we went along. So that was a factor that we had at that time that people did, as I read about it. So it was nothing. It was nothing to people to be that way or enjoy those types of things. So it was common. So since people had pocket knives, then if they needed to fix something, they just pull their pocket knife out and whittle it down or do those type of things. So nobody worried about that. Now, carrying a pocket knife, if you get caught at school carrying a pocket knife, you are in serious trouble because of the violent attitude, I guess, that society has towards these things. But I understand it also that people look at things a lot more differently today than what they used to look at. So anyway, as that had rotated through the years, and we go back to the 1800s, 1900s, we understand that carving was, people didn't look at these pieces quite as profound as we look at them today and consider them classics. They were just pieces for their kids to play with, and they were not what you would really call museum pieces at that time. They were good carvings. They were excellent carvings. But people didn't always buy them for that purpose. They bought them for their children to play with. And of course, children kind of rough on things anyway, so I'm sure a lot of these carvings got broken and destroyed over time as we went, as we know now. So anyway, that period was a period of people that made things. Now people just don't make anything themselves. They go and buy, and whatever they buy, when it goes bad or whatever and it runs out, well, they buy something else. That's usually the case as we go down that road. So I'm just doing the little coat here, inside the coat. So the different time and the different era that you had, people didn't have and time was another factor as well. And when I say that, we didn't have the entertainment that we have today. You know, my grandkids, when they come over, they like these things on YouTube, and they watch YouTube and social media and Think Doodle. It's a little cat. It's, they just sit and watch that all day long. And most of us remember there was not a time like that in our lives. We had to either be doing something or working, but we just didn't have the free time that we have today to just sit and watch anything. And we didn't have the entertainment. I remember cartoons at one time. The only time that you could watch cartoons was on Saturday morning. Now you can watch them 24 hours a day. But the reason for that is that's when people were off on Saturdays, and cartoons and all those things came on for the kids. But now you have constantly, we had 3 channels, you have now 300 channels. So when you had a period of time where things were very slow, that's one of the refineries blowing their horn. I mean, a refinery. It's at a refinery. It's a train at one of the refineries blowing their horn. And so people didn't have the free time. So whatever free time they had, they would use to maybe whittle or do something like that. You've seen pictures of men in squares. Used to get out in the middle of the square and they'd talk. And this was something, see, this was something, if you're young, it's really hard for you to understand. But people communicated back then. Us older people understood that period of time. People did communicate. And during that time of communication, that was the only way we knew one another. You say, well, why do you talk about those things? Why do you discuss them? Because it's an era, it was an era that we did not have communication with one another unless we talked to one another. The neighbors didn't even know who one another were unless they talked to one another. Nowadays, people live next door to people for 10 years and don't even know their neighbors, because they've got so many things going on that there is no communication. But back then, it was a totally different era. It was an era of people who talked to one another, and that was the only way that you got to know one another. That was it. So really, everybody, all their neighbors pretty much knew one another, because we would get outside and we would do those things. So during that time, as a form of communication, people would sit in the afternoons, sometimes over at their neighbor's house, and they would sit and talk. And at that time, they would whittle. A lot of times, they would sit, talk, just like we do at our club, and they would whittle at the same time, or pick up a branch, or and usually the whittling that they did, they would go pick something off of a branch of a tree, and they would carve, and they would whittle. And that was what the joy of what people would do back then. So that's where a lot of that has come. Just like your club, as they sit and they talk about things and whittle or do a project or whatever. So what that is all about is what people did as a normal thing back at one time. I remember my father and mother. I remember grandmother and those things. On Sunday afternoons, they would sit on the porch. Everybody had a front porch, and they would sit on a front porch and they would talk after dinner. And they would just